Jake Morton had always prided himself on being a hard worker. At 34, he was a single father to an energetic 6-year-old named Lily, who never failed to brighten his days despite the dark clouds that seemed to hover over their lives. Ever since Lily's mother had passed away unexpectedly 3 years ago, Jake had been doing everything he could to keep their small family afloat. Between his day job as a delivery driver and his nightly shifts at a local diner, the bills were barely covered, but he never let Lily see his exhaustion. His girl deserved the world, and Jake was determined to provide it, even if it meant putting his own needs on hold indefinitely. It was a cold Wednesday afternoon when Jake found himself at the local grocery store, clutching a short shopping list in one hand and a battered wallet in the other. Lily had been asking for pancakes for breakfast, and he'd promised her he would make them, no matter how tight things were. Syrup, eggs, and a small bag of pancake mix were all he could manage this week, but he figured he'd make it special by shaping the pancakes like hearts. As Jake scanned the aisles, he noticed an elderly man in a faded green coat struggling near the canned goods section. The man's hands trembled as he tried to lift a heavy can of soup into his basket, which was already leaning precariously on an unsteady walker. Jake paused, his instincts kicking in. Something about the frailty of the man reminded him of his own late grandfather, who had once been so vibrant but had grown increasingly dependent on others in his final years. "Let me get that for you," Jake said, stepping forward and carefully picking up the can. The man looked up at him, startled, his watery blue eyes wide behind thick glasses. "Oh, thank you, young man," the elderly man said, his voice trembling slightly. "These old hands aren't what they used to be." Jake smiled as he placed the can and the basket hooked onto the walker. "No problem. Need help with anything else?" The man hesitated, glancing at his shopping list, which was written in a shaky hand on a torn piece of paper. "Well, I could use a little help finding a few things. It's hard to read the labels these days, and the shelves seem taller than they were when I was younger." Jake glanced at his watch. He was cutting it close with time. His shift at the diner started in an hour. But something in the man's gentle demeanor and obvious need made him push those concerns aside. "I've got a little time," Jake said. "What else do you need?" Over the next 20 minutes, Jake guided the man, whose name was Walter, through the aisles. Walter chatted as they went, sharing bits and pieces of his life. He'd lived in the same neighborhood for decades, though most of his friends had moved away or passed on. His wife, Margaret, had died 10 years ago, and their only child had been lost in a tragic accident years before that. Walter's family was scattered, a brother in another state, a few nieces and nephews he barely saw. Jake listened intently, nodding and offering small words of sympathy where he could. When they finally reached the checkout, Walter fumbled with his wallet, his hands shaking so much that he nearly dropped it. Jake stepped in again, steadying the wallet and helping Walter count out the cash. The cashier gave Jake an appreciative smile as Walter thanked him profusely. "You've been so kind," Walter said as they exited the store together. "I don't know what I would have done without your help." "It's nothing," Jake replied, adjusting his own small grocery bag in his hand. "I'm glad I could help." Walter paused by the curb, looking uncertain. "My ride was supposed to be here, but it looks like they're running late." Jake glanced at the busy street, then back at Walter. "Where do you live? I can give you a lift if you don't mind an old car." Walter's face lit up with relief. "Oh, I'd be grateful. I'm not far, just a few blocks over on Maple Avenue." They reached Jake's beat-up sedan, and Jake helped Walter carefully fold his walker and load it into the back seat before settling him into the passenger side. The car sputtered as Jake turned the key, but it started, and they were off. Walter continued to chat, thanking Jake repeatedly and sharing more stories about his late wife and their life together. Jake found himself genuinely enjoying the man's company, despite the ache in his back and the worry in the pit of his stomach about being late for work. When they pulled up to Walter's modest home, Walter insisted on inviting Jake in for a cup of tea as thanks. Jake hesitated, glancing at the clock. He really couldn't afford to lose this job. But Walter's expression was so earnest that Jake found himself agreeing. The inside of Walter's house was cozy but clearly showed signs of age and neglect. Jake could see that Walter had difficulty keeping up with household tasks. Dust clung to surfaces and the sink was piled with dishes. Still, it was clear that Walter took pride in his home, as evidenced by the carefully arranged photos on the mantel and the neatly folded Afghan on the couch. As they sat down, Walter handed Jake a steaming mug of tea. "You've been such a blessing to me today," Walter said, his voice thick with emotion. "People don't often stop to help someone like me anymore." Jake shrugged, feeling a little embarrassed by the praise. "It's just how I was raised. My dad always said to lend a hand when you can." Walter nodded, his eyes softening. "Your father sounds like a good man. You've got a good heart, son." They talked for a while longer, and Jake found himself opening up about his own struggles. He mentioned Lily, his long hours, and the constant juggling act of trying to be a good father while keeping the lights on. Walter listened quietly, his expression growing somber. When Jake finally stood to leave, Walter clasped his hand firmly. "Thank you, Jake. You've done more for me than you realize." Jake smiled. "Take care of yourself, Walter. And if you ever need help with groceries again, just give me a call." He jotted down his number on a scrap of paper before heading out the door. As Jake drove to work, running through excuses in his head for his inevitable tardiness, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just met someone extraordinary. He had no idea that this simple act of kindness would set in motion a series of events that would change his life forever. Jake barely made it to his shift at the diner, clocking in just as his manager, Linda, shot him a warning glance. He mouthed a quick apology before tying his apron and heading to his usual section. The dinner rush was in full swing, and for the next few hours, he barely had a moment to breathe. Orders flew in, customers came and went, and by the time things slowed down, his feet throbbed and his back ached from weaving between tables. But despite the exhaustion, something about the evening felt different. His mind kept drifting back to Walter, his gentle voice, the way his hands trembled, the loneliness in his eyes. There was something about the man that tugged at Jake in a way he couldn't quite explain. By the time he arrived home later that night, Lily was already asleep, curled up with her favorite stuffed bunny. His neighbor, Mrs. Castillo, who often watched her when he worked late, had left a small note on the counter reminding him to pick up Lily's school supplies for an upcoming project. Jake sighed as he glanced at his wallet, knowing it was already running on fumes. The following days passed in a blur. Between work, taking Lily to school, and scraping together money for rent, Jake barely had time to think about anything else. But then, on Sunday afternoon, his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but something told him to answer. "Hello." "Jake, my boy. It's Walter." Jake's face broke into a smile. "Walter, how are you?" "Oh, I'm managing," Walter said, his voice warm but tired. "Listen, I hate to be a bother, but I was wondering if you might have time to stop by this week. I could use a little help around the house and, well, I'd enjoy the company." Jake hesitated, glancing at Lily, who was coloring at the kitchen table. He barely had time to take care of his own responsibilities, let alone add more to his plate. But then he looked at Lily's small, focused face. What kind of example would he be setting if he ignored someone in need? "Of course, Walter," Jake said. "How about tomorrow afternoon?" Walter sounded relieved. "That would be wonderful, son. Thank you." The next day, after finishing his morning deliveries, Jake picked Lily up from school and drove to Walter's house. When they arrived, Walter greeted them at the door with a broad smile. "And who is this lovely young lady?" Walter asked, crouching slightly to meet Lily's gaze. "I'm Lily," she said brightly. "Are you my daddy's friend?" Walter chuckled. "I'd like to think so." Lily beamed, and just like that, she had decided Walter was part of their little world. Jake spent the next few hours helping Walter with small repairs around the house, fixing a leaky faucet, replacing a flickering light bulb, and moving some heavy furniture that Walter admitted had been in the wrong spot for years. Meanwhile, Lily chatted away, showing Walter her drawings and asking him endless questions about the olden days as she called them. Walter, to his credit, answered every single one, his eyes twinkling as he told stories about his childhood, his late wife, and the adventures he'd had before old age slowed him down. As the sun began to set, Walter insisted they stay for dinner. Jake tried to refuse, but Walter wouldn't hear of it. "It's been a long time since I've cooked for company," he said. "Besides, I have more food than I know what to do with." Jake relented, and soon, the house was filled with the comforting smell of homemade stew. They ate together at the worn wooden table, and for the first time in a long time, Jake felt something close to peace. After dinner, Walter pulled Jake aside. "I can't tell you how much this means to me," he said quietly. "It gets lonely in this house, and it's nice to feel needed again." Jake felt a pang in his chest. "You are needed, Walter," he said. "You're family now." Walter's eyes shone with unshed tears. "That means more to me than you know." As Jake drove home that night, with Lily fast asleep in the back seat, he realized something. Helping Walter wasn't a burden, it was a gift. And somehow, without even trying, Walter had given something back to them as well. Neither of them knew it yet. But this was only the beginning. The weeks passed, and what started as a one-time favor soon became a regular routine. Every few days, after Jake finished his deliveries and picked up Lily from school, they would stop by Walter's house. Sometimes Jake helped with household chores, fixing things Walter could no longer manage on his own. Other times they simply sat together, sharing stories over a warm meal. Walter quickly became more than just a friend, he became a fixture in their lives. Lily adored him, and Walter, in turn, treated her like the granddaughter he never had. He taught her how to play checkers, listened patiently as she told him every detail about her favorite cartoon, and even let her paint his nails one afternoon, much to Jake's amusement. One evening, as Jake stood by the sink washing dishes after another shared dinner, Walter shuffled into the kitchen with a thoughtful look on his face. "Jake, can I ask you something?" Walter said, lowering himself onto a chair. "Of course," Jake replied, rinsing off a plate. Walter hesitated, tracing a knot in the wooden table with a finger. "Why haven't you ever asked for anything in return?" Jake frowned, shutting off the water. "What do you mean?" "You've helped me so much these past few weeks," Walter said. "Most people these days expect something in return. But you just do it because you're kind." Jake leaned against the counter, drying his hands on a towel. "I don't really think about it that way," he admitted. "I guess I know what it's like to need help. And if I can make someone's life a little easier, why wouldn't I?" Walter studied him for a long moment. "You're a rare kind of person, Jake." Jake chuckled. "I don't know about that. I'm just trying to get by, same as everyone else." Walter didn't say anything more, but something about his expression made Jake feel as if the old man was carrying a secret. A few days later, after another visit, Walter surprised Jake by asking for a ride somewhere. "Where are we going?" Jake asked as he helped Walter into the car. "The bank," Walter said simply. Jake didn't question it, assuming Walter had some bills to pay. When they arrived, Jake waited outside while Walter disappeared inside the building. 15 minutes later, Walter emerged, carrying a thick envelope. Back in the car, Walter turned to Jake, his hands gripping the envelope tightly. "Jake, pull over for a minute." Confused, Jake did as he was asked, parking in a quiet lot near a small park. Walter took a deep breath before handing Jake the envelope. "What's this?" Jake asked cautiously. Walter's eyes were serious, but there was warmth there too. $20,000, he said. Jake nearly dropped the envelope. His heart pounded in his chest. "Walter, I can't take this." Walter chuckled, shaking his head. "You can. And you will." Jake opened his mouth to argue, but Walter held up a hand. "Listen to me, son. I don't have anyone to spend my money on. My wife is gone, my child is gone, my family they're distant, and we barely talk. I've spent years accumulating wealth, and for what? To sit alone in a house filled with memories. Walter's voice softened. But you've been a friend to me, Jake. You and that little girl of yours, you've given me something I didn't think I'd have again. A reason to look forward to my days. Jake swallowed hard, his throat tightening. Walter, I helped you because I wanted to, not because I expected anything. I know, Walter said, smiling. That's exactly why you deserve it. Jake stared at the envelope, his hands trembling. $20,000. It was more money than he had ever held in his life. It meant security, a cushion to breathe, maybe even a chance to start fresh. But accepting it felt wrong. Walter must have sensed his hesitation. This isn't charity, Jake. It's a gift. And if it makes you feel better, consider it an investment. Jake frowned. An investment in what? In you, Walter said simply. In your future, in Lily's future. Jake exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling on his chest. Finally, he met Walter's gaze and nodded. Okay, but only if you let me keep helping you too. Walter chuckled, clapping Jake on the shoulder. I wouldn't have it any other way. And with that, everything changed. Jake held the envelope in his hands long after he dropped Walter off at home. $20,000. It didn't feel real. He had spent years scraping by, counting every dollar, stretching every meal, and suddenly here was more money than he had ever had in one place. It could change everything. That night, after putting Lily to bed, he sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the envelope like it might vanish if he looked away. His first instinct was to tuck it away somewhere safe, maybe pretend it wasn't there so he wouldn't be tempted to spend it foolishly. But as he thought about it, the reality of what this money could mean began to settle in. Rent. Bills. Food. New shoes for Lily. Ones that actually fit instead of the second-hand ones he kept patching up. A savings account, something he had never been able to maintain. A chance to breathe. But even as those thoughts swirled in his mind, another feeling gnawed at him: guilt. He hadn't earned this money. He hadn't worked for it. Accepting it still felt strange. The next morning, he drove Lily to school, then made his way to Walter's house. He hadn't planned on stopping by so soon, but something told him he needed to talk to the old man again. Walter greeted him with a knowing smile when he opened the door. Ah, I wondered how long it would take before you came back. Jake chuckled, stepping inside. I needed to see you. Walter motioned for him to sit, lowering himself into his own chair across from Jake at the worn wooden table. You're struggling with it, aren't you? Jake sighed, rubbing his hands together. It just feels, I don't know, unfair. Like I didn't do anything to deserve it. Walter studied him for a moment before shaking his head with a chuckle. Son, you've got it all backward. If anyone deserves it, it's you. Jake frowned. How can you say that? Walter leaned back in his chair, resting his hands on his stomach. Because I know the kind of man you are. I've spent a lot of years watching people look past me. People who only cared about what I could offer them. But you, he pointed a finger at Jake. You helped me without expecting a thing in return. That's a rare thing in this world. Jake shook his head. That's just how I was raised. Walter's smile softened. And that's exactly why I wanted to help you. They sat in silence for a moment before Walter leaned forward. Let me tell you something, Jake. Money, real money, it's only as valuable as the good it can do. I spent my life earning it, saving it, investing it. But what did it get me? Empty house. A bank account I don't even care to check anymore. What's the point of having all this wealth if I don't use it to help someone who actually needs it? Jake swallowed the lump in his throat, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. I just don't want to feel like I'm taking advantage of you. Walter chuckled. If you were, you'd have asked for a whole lot more. That made Jake laugh. and for the first time since Walter had handed him the envelope, he felt the weight on his chest start to lift. "All right," Jake said finally, meeting Walter's eyes. "I'll use the money. But only if you let me do something for you in return." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Jake thought for a moment. "I don't know yet. But I'll figure it out." Walter grinned. "Fair enough." Over the next few days, Jake started making small changes. He paid off the past due bills that had been piling up, filled the fridge with fresh groceries, and for the first time in years, bought himself a new pair of work shoes instead of wearing the ones that had been falling apart. But the biggest change came for Lily. One afternoon, Jake picked her up from school and took her to a small toy store downtown. He hadn't told her why they were there. He wanted it to be a surprise. Lily's eyes widened as they stepped inside. "Daddy, is this our we?" Jake smiled. "You get to pick something. Anything you want." Her mouth fell open. "Anything." Jake nodded, laughing as she sprinted off, her tiny sneakers squeaking against the tile floor. She took her time, carefully inspecting each aisle like she was making the most important decision of her life. In the end, she chose a stuffed unicorn, cradling it in her arms like it was made of gold. "Are you sure that's the one you want?" Jake asked. She nodded eagerly. "Her name is Sparkle." Jake knelt down and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Then Sparkle it is." As they walked to the counter, Jake felt something stir inside him, relief, maybe even joy. It wasn't about the money. It was about what it gave them. A little breathing room. A moment to enjoy life. Later that evening, after putting Lily to bed, Jake sat at the kitchen table, flipping through his notebook where he kept track of his expenses. There was still money left, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't terrified of the future. But Walter's words kept echoing in his head. Money is only as valuable as the good it can do. And Jake wasn't done doing good yet. He had an idea. A few days later, Jake pulled into Walter's driveway with a new sense of purpose. He had spent the past few nights thinking about everything Walter had said, about what it really meant to use money for good. Walter had given him an incredible gift, not just in the form of cash but in reminding him that kindness wasn't something to be measured, it was meant to be given freely. And now, Jake was ready to return the favor. As he stepped up to the front door, he noticed something. Walter's house, while warm and full of memories, was falling apart in ways that Walter hadn't mentioned. The roof had shingles missing, the paint on the porch was peeling, and the yard, once cared for, was now overgrown. Walter had always been independent, never one to complain, but Jake could see now how much he struggled. Walter opened the door, smiling as always. "Jake, my boy, come in." Jake followed him inside and sat down in the familiar chair at the kitchen table. Walter poured 2 cups of coffee, the way he always did when Jake visited. But before he could start chatting about the weather or some story from his younger days, Jake cleared his throat. "I want to do something for you," Jake said. Walter tilted his head. "Son, you've already done more than enough." Jake shook his head. "No, I mean really do something for you. You gave me a gift, Walter. More than the money, you gave me hope. A chance to breathe. And I want to give something back." Walter narrowed his eyes, a playful suspicion creeping into his expression. "And what exactly do you have in mind?" Jake grinned. "Your house. It needs some work." Walter waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, it's fine. A little rough around the edges, sure, but she's held up well enough." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Walter, the roof is missing shingles, the gutters are falling apart, and don't even get me started on the back fence." Walter let out a long sigh, rubbing his forehead before finally leaning back in his chair. I know, he admitted. "I see it every day. I tell myself I should do something about it, but..." He exhaled slowly. "I guess I just got used to letting things go." He paused, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. After Margaret passed, I kept up with everything for a while. Paid for repairs, had people come in to fix what I couldn't. But after a few years it just stopped feeling worth it. He let out a soft chuckle, though there was no humor in it. What's the point of fixing up a house when you're the only one living in it? When there's no one around to notice the fresh paint or the trimmed hedges? Jake felt a pang in his chest. Walter had been alone for so long, and it was clear he had started to believe that taking care of himself and his home just didn't matter anymore. Well, someone notices now, Jake said firmly. And that's why I want to help. Walter looked at him for a long moment before a small, reluctant smile pulled at the corners of his mouth. I suppose I have let things go a bit, he admitted. So let me help, Jake said. I know a guy who does roofing for cheap. I can fix the porch myself. I can even get the yard cleaned up. Let me do this for you. Walter shook his head, chuckling. You really don't give up, do you? Nope, Jake said, grinning. Walter sighed, but it was the kind of sigh that came from someone who knew they had already lost an argument. All right, but only if you let me help, too. Jake smirked. Deal. The next week, with the help of a few friends from the diner and a couple of workers Jake had hired with a portion of the money Walter had given him, they got to work. The repairs weren't extravagant, but they made a difference. The roof was patched up, the porch repainted, and the yard trimmed and cleared. Walter, true to his word, helped where he could, mostly by offering wisecracks and handing out lemonade. By the end of the week, the house looked brand new. Walter stood in his front yard, hands on his hips, shaking his head in disbelief. I don't know what to say, he murmured. Jake clapped a hand on his shoulder. Just say you'll take better care of it now. Walter chuckled. I think I can manage that. That evening, they all sat on the newly painted porch. Walter, Jake, and Lily, who was busy making flower crowns from freshly cut wildflowers. The summer air was warm, the stars just beginning to peek out from the darkening sky. It was peaceful. The kind of moment Jake had rarely allowed himself to have. Walter took a slow sip of his tea before looking at Jake. You know, I've been thinking about something. Jake raised an eyebrow. That sounds dangerous. Walter laughed. Smart aleck. No, but seriously, I don't want this to be the last good thing I do with my money. Jake nodded, listening. Walter leaned back in his chair. I spent too many years worrying about numbers in a bank account. But watching you, seeing how you took what I gave you and used it to help others, well, it got me thinking. Maybe it's time I did the same. Jake tilted his head. What do you mean? Walter smiled. I want to set up something bigger. A foundation, maybe. Something that helps families like yours, single parents trying to make ends meet, people who just need a little breathing room to get back on their feet. And I want you to help me run it. Jake blinked, completely caught off guard. Wait, what? Walter nodded. You've got a good heart, Jake. And you know what it's like to struggle. That's exactly the kind of person who should be helping others. What do you say? Jake looked down at Lily, who had just finished making a flower crown and was now carefully placing it on Walter's head, giggling. Walter chuckled, adjusting it slightly so it wouldn't fall off. The sight of the old man wearing a crown of daisies and smiling like a kid made something settle deep inside Jake. He had spent so long just trying to survive, never thinking he'd have the chance to do more than that. And yet, here he was. A friend. A purpose. A future that looked brighter than it ever had before. Jake took a deep breath, then smiled. I say, let's do some good. Walter grinned, tipping his imaginary hat beneath his new floral crown. Now that's what I like to hear. And just like that, everything changed, not just for Jake, but for so many others who would one day benefit from an act of kindness that had started in a grocery store aisle. Because in the end, the greatest wealth wasn't money. It was the kindness we shared,